Up against the Arizona-Utah border of the United States lies a town populated with roughly 10,000 excessively fanatical members of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, or the FLDS. They differ from conventional Mormons in that they continue, with enthusiasm, the practice of polygamy. That is, a husband having several wives. Carolyn Jessup was married and raised as a member of the FLDS community. The group became increasingly extreme as its comparatively moderate prophet got sick and older, and his son, the infamous Warren Jeffs, assumed power. And boys, did he assume power. You may recall the name Jeffs. He was recently handed 10 years in jail terms for being an accomplice to rape after he was found guilty of forcing a 14-year-old girl to marry her 19-year-old cousin. Caroline lived by the teachings of the faith, including sharing her controlling husband with 5 other wives. That was until the age of 35, when, with her 8 children, she felt she absolutely had to escape, to get out. And she tells her story in her new book, Escape. It's a most apt title because that's what her entire life seems to have been leading up to. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you. Well,
first of all, congratulations. It's an absolutely compelling story. And when the writer's strike is over in the US, I can't but believe that those who've been inactive in their penmanship will be putting together something detailing your life. I was asking who you'd fancy to play you. Would it be at this stage? Have you any ideas?
I don't have any ideas on that.
You should start thinking about that. It's very important. Now, you were born into the community. I suppose if you went back to the 50s and the post-Second World War period, there were those who interloped into it, but you were actually born into the community.
I was born into the community. My mother was also born into the community. I was 6 generations of polygamy. So it's a generational heritage. My grandmother...
Who you adored.
Who I adored, yeah. Great-grandmother came out of the Mormon church and become members of this fundamentalist group.
Now they differ from. We're familiar with the Mormons in this
right.
country. Obviously, they have a fairly substantial presence. It's not a huge community, but we know of them.
Right.
And we are probably not so familiar with that breakaway group who believe that polygamy, the practice of having several wives, is in fact central to the real essence of Mormonism. So we don't know that much about it in this country. So can you explain that to the listeners, what that is about, what that teaching is about, and where it came from?
Well,
what a handy idea it was for the men who thought it up.
Well, polygamy actually was started with the prophet Joseph Smith, and then continued with Brigham Young, and then John Taylor was the 3rd prophet in the Mormon Church. The 4th prophet signed the manifesto and got rid of polygamy. It
was originally there, I presume, to increase the numbers of the church.
I'm not sure.
Is that too conservative?
I'm not sure what the real reasons were for it. The theological reasons is that in order to qualify for the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, you have to have upwards of 3 wives, and you have to live polygamy on this earth. Now, at the time that the church signed the manifesto, then that doctrine changed. But before that, then up to the early 1900s, then that was a strong belief in the Mormon church. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of the first men that Joseph Smith introduced to the principle of polygamy. He had 7 wives. 7. And then it just, was passed from one generation to the next. And then my ancestors, at the time of the manifesto, they didn't give up the polygamy and the concepts of polygamy. They didn't feel like that you could just flip-flop in a religion and change a fundamental principle.
Now, you learnt about the principles, the celestial higher order, the idea that, first of all, the entire church, these are the only people who are going to get into heaven. And when the day of reckoning comes, only those who have become part of the church and have adopted its practices and its teachings will actually get into heaven. So this is, if you believe this, it's a pretty powerful place to be. And then you add in stuff like you've got to have several wives, and this is good for you. It's also good for them. It's, I suppose, gilding of the ticket. It ensures that you're going to have a very high place in heaven when you get there. You learnt all of these things literally at your grandmother's knee.
Yeah, my grandmother taught me that. I was indoctrinated into the concept of polygamy from my mother and my grandmother.
And she sounds like she was a good teacher.
She was great. She actually was a teacher, and and her parents were teachers, and she had a real fabulous side to her and endearing side, but she was very committed to her religious beliefs, and unfortunately for me, that involved polygamy in this radical religion that eventually evolved into a dangerous and destructive cult. In my grandmother's day, it didn't meet the qualifications of a dangerous and destructive cult, but every generation it seems to have become more severe as the leadership in the religion changed and became more extreme.
Can you remember, as a teenager, even Amish teenagers can be troublesome. Catholic teenagers are troublesome. Jewish teenagers are troublesome. I presume Buddhist teenagers are troublesome. It is the nature of the beast. So what happens when you're like 13, 14, 15 and you're hearing this polygamy idea? Did it still sound like a good plan to you, or something that you'd submit to?
Well, it was kind of a situation where you really didn't see a way around it. Typically, if a woman tried to escape, or a young girl, then you were chased, hunted down, and brought back. As a woman or as a young lady, you were not allowed to leave. We were taught that you never get to an age where you have your own freedom. Like 18 in America, legally, you have the right to do what you want at that point. You don't have to do what your parents want anymore. Yeah. But in this religion, then, I was taught strongly that no, you're never 18. You never have a right to make your own choices. You have a priesthood head over you at all times as a woman. He makes all of your choices. Before you're married, that's your father. After you're married, that's your husband. So you're very controlled as a woman within the society from birth. And, even as a married woman, you're not allowed to have a bank account or access to money or accesses to any type of control in your own life, or in your children's lives for that matter.
Are you allowed to have a passport or a driving license? Or...
Well, you're allowed to have a driver's license because it's difficult in America to survive without one.
Yeah.
But very often, like for me, I was 18 before I was allowed to have that. And so it's a lot more restrictive than most teenagers. And then no contact with boys. We were not allowed to have any association with boys whatsoever. Now, if a young man wants to leave the society, that's different. That's almost encouraged. Because for every man who gets an additional wife, a young man has to go. And it's usually the younger man or male population that's expelled from the community. When I was a teenager, then the young man would leave around the age of 20, 18, sometimes 24. And they usually just left because they got all the marriages were arranged. They'd never get assigned a wife. They'd just get sick of it and leave.
So all the old fellas would get the girls?
Not necessarily.
Initially, I think the girls chose who was going to be her husband. You may have become part of a harem, literally, but you did get to choose. Now, this wasn't much use if you're a sort of doddry old fella.
That was in my grandmother's day, but the problem with that is that when with the advent of transportation, and it became a little easier to leave the community, well, then they could see that polygamy was going to be over real quickly. And then they brought in arranged marriages or placement marriages where the prophet would get a revelation from God as to where a woman belonged. And that occurred when...
And it was never with the really good-looking 22-year-old guy?
Not usually. That occurred with my mother, in my mother's generation. So my parents were an arranged marriage, and every marriage within this community was arranged.
Now, not untypically with cults, this seems to be, of course, internally the thing often reflects the pressures that are being externally imposed on the relationships. Despite all this higher celestial stuff, and despite we're all going to heaven but the Catholics and the Presbyterians are not, despite all of that, the marriages didn't actually work well as marriages.
Not usually.
Your parents didn't get on at all.
No, they couldn't be in the same room for 5 minutes before they were screaming at each other. Their personalities were about as opposite as you could find. And very often the arranged marriages absolutely did not work. They were just very difficult. But once you're married to a man, you become his possession, and there is no option for divorce. It just does not happen in this society.
And what were your parents like? Did they give you any breathing space? The stories in the book, for instance, of your mother sneaking you treats, giving you Christmas trees, which you're not meant to have, things like that. But there's other darker dimensions to her personality as well.
There were emotional sides to my mother where she had that nature and that side, but she also had a darker side too. But with her, it was just a matter of deep depression. She was in a loveless marriage. She was in a community that she absolutely hated, but believed in.
Did she ever say that to you? Did she ever say, I hate this?
Yes.
You should run away. This is appalling.
She did. She complained about life on a daily basis, and she absolutely hated the lifestyle, but she believed in it, and she thought she had to do it. And so
she bought the package. She believed in the higher celestial thing, the whole unique nature that only you guys got to heaven, nobody else did, but I hate it.
Right.
Sounds very Catholic, actually. So this must have made her deeply unhappy. Must have made for a very unhappy childhood.
She was terribly unhappy. I mean, I don't remember a morning of getting up when I was little and not having her talk about killing herself. That's how unhappy she was.
And how many wives did your father have?
He ended up with 3. 2 during the time that I was when I was a child. After I was married for a few years, then he married the 3rd wife.
Now, what's it like to be? I mean, do they stay in the same home?
In this, there's several polygamous communities throughout the western states, but this particular polygamous community is the most fanatical. And in this one, they do. We were all required to live in the same home. And it was a very bad idea to require women to live on top of each other like that, share the same husband, share the same kitchen, share the same bathroom facility, share the children. I mean, it was just, it made life just a state of constant turmoil, constant pressures that couldn't be resolved because there was always a fight for who's going to have the home ran the way they want it ran.
I mean, I presume the natural instinct that, I don't know whether afflict is the right word or celebrates a woman will have been at play in your community where a woman will go, well, I'm not having it like this. And in fact, I'm the top wife. I mean, I presume these things are unstoppable.
It's human nature. And I mean, growing up in a community of, well, it was around 6,000 at the time I lived there, and everybody believed in polygamy and many families were involved in it. I didn't see a family where there was not what we classified as the favorite wife. And she pretty much ran the family, and she called the shots, and everything had to be done the way she wanted it done. And which was very traumatic for everybody else that got to be on the lower end of the totem pole.
And what makes a favourite wife? Is it her looks? Is it her personality? Is it her intelligence? Is it luck?
It varies, and it depends on the man. I think that it's just very difficult. I haven't seen a situation where a man's ever fallen in love with more than one woman at a time, truly, deeply fallen in love with more than one at a time. And so I think it's hard on the men too, because they are required to, father children with multiple women, have multiple wives, and try to have relationships with them. But if they fall in love with one wife, that's very difficult.
Yeah, it's one thing to have sex with a lot of women, right?
Right.
I think most men are qualified, if they were put to the pin of their collar, to do that. But to have an affectionate or romantic or even civilised relationship with a lot of women in the one home, I think would be quite dangerous.
It doesn't happen, and it doesn't work. And civilised, if you can even get it at a civilised level, that's fabulous, but it doesn't generally get to that level. And then most of the time a man will fall in love with one wife. I mean, especially with arranged marriages, if he ends up with 3 or 4 wives, 3 of them will not have compatible personalities. I can almost always guarantee it. And there usually will be one wife that he will have
that he'll relate to better.
Yeah, there will be chemistry there or something more that works there for them, and then she will end up being the favorite wife. So, it doesn't necessarily depend on beauty. A lot of it depends on chemistry. A lot of it depends on personality. And sometimes it does depend on intelligence.
In studio this morning, we've Carolyn Jessup, the author of Escape, the story of her fleeing and her flight from the Mormon community on the border of Utah and Arizona. When did this happen, by the way, Caroline? When did you...
I left April 22nd, 2003, so it was nearly 4.5 years ago.
Yeah, it's still not that long ago.
Yeah.
Now, we've got as far in your story as to paint a picture of what it was like, pressurised for everybody living in this community. There were, of course, other external pressures because the community, not unlike the Amish community, looked and behaved differently from the rest of the world. They were doing something, of course, in the extreme sense of Mormon day-to-day life, polygamy, that was illegal. I don't think there's any state where it wasn't illegal. Was there?
Polygamy is illegal in the United States. However, the way they got around that legally is that men do not marry their wives legally. They'll marry one wife legally, and then all the rest of the wives are married spiritually. Well, you're all married spiritually.
Yeah.
And so it's just a situation of how do you prosecute it, because you can't prove anything, not with legal documentation. So the laws on the books right now in the United States, they don't address this problem.
And of course, if you've got the local constabulary and the judiciary and the welfare people possibly as reasonably close to the community, or maybe even members of it, there's not going to be any tremendous interest in prosecuting it.
Well, everyone in the community that I was involved in were members of this cult.
Yeah.
Police, the city, everybody. So, it was like the community was like its own separate little country, and we didn't follow normal laws and rules of society. We did our own thing.
Did you watch television? Did you listen to the radio? Did you buy records?
Very limited. When I was little, a little bit of that was allowed. Later, as the religion became more extreme, it became more and more off limits. And then when Warren took over, it was like we couldn't even have outside literature. I had a collection of 300 children's books, and every one of them were destroyed. And they were books like Charlotte's Web. I mean, they were tasteful literature, but because they were from the outside world, we had to get rid of them. So at that point, we couldn't listen to the radio, we couldn't have internet, we couldn't have newspaper. It was just everything was off limits.
What precipitates the increase in fundamentalism and in paranoia? What was making this happen amongst the leaders?
Well, every time leadership changed, then, day-to-day life changed in a tremendous way. And we went from a relatively moderate prophet, very strict and conservative, but moderate by comparison to what we went into. It was Leroy Johnson was the prophet that I was raised under. And then after that, it was Roland Jeffs. And then he completely stopped any form of college education. And even before his first stroke, he started shutting down high school education within the community. And when Warren took over, we lost all education.
And to the state, I mean, that's illegal.
It is illegal, and the states right now are doing nothing about it, because in the states of Arizona and Utah, parents are allowed to homeschool their children.
Well, we have homeschooling here as well, but homeschooling there is a definition. For instance, I couldn't have my children at home and tell them that teddy bears, butterflies and clouds were the most important three things on the agenda today, and that's all we're going to discuss. Eventually, somebody'd arrive in from the inspectorate and go, no, this isn't working.
That's the problem. Is we did have some laws within the states when homeschooling first started, at least in Arizona and Utah, and since all the regulations and requirements have been removed. And if you decide to homeschool your child, you're just on your own. It's up to you, and you can basically teach them what you want or not teach them what you want, which in reality needs to be addressed statewide anyway. But primarily, I think the reasons the regulations were removed is that the homeschooling children were coming in with much higher scores than the children being educated in the public school systems. So this state was like, this is costing us an enormous amount of money to monitor, and based on results, we don't need to monitor it. These are more responsible parents. But
of course in your community.
But in our community, they all of a sudden jumped on that, took advantage of it, and now children are being deprived of an education and
brainwashed.
And brainwashed at the same time. And so many of the young people coming out of this community now are functionally illiterate because they've had no schooling. They're reading on a first grade level.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I ended up with 35. My father ended up fathering. Well, he ended up with about 36.
Over 35 brothers and sisters.
Yes.
Do you have any contact with them now?
Some. I have contact with the ones that got out, but I still have a tremendous amount of them within this society, and I have not had any contact with them. Once you leave, then
and this is a fellow who had only, I use the word cautiously, only had 3 wives.
Right. My ex-husband, he ended up having 7 wives during the course of our marriage, and he fathered 54 children.
Even by Irish standards, that's a pretty big family. Now, you were a smart girl. You are a smart girl. You developed a reputation, I think, as being outspoken, and, you know, you had your own mind. You can never hide those things, you know. I think there was only one Anne Frank. I think if you're smart and you believe in things, it'll always seep out. So
it's difficult to hide it.
Yeah, it defines you then. So which is useful, you know, whether you're in your community or another one. But in your case, it would have singled you out as you were growing up as somebody to maybe keep an eye on. And certainly by the time you get married, it really singles you out as somebody to keep an eye on. How did you get selected to be married to this man, Merrill?
That was actually a mistake. He wanted to marry my younger sister. She was gorgeous. She had very long blonde hair. It was almost white down to her knees. She was very tall. She was absolutely stunning. Prettiest blue eyes you ever saw in your life. He asked for her, and the problem was he went to the prophet and asked if he could marry her. The problem was he had our names mixed up. So unbeknownst to him, he had asked for me. So then, around the time we get married, which was
you're not ungorgeous yourself, so I mean.
But she was just stunning. I mean, she was at that point in our lives, she was really, really incredibly beautiful, and so we get married about 2.5 days after
what happened
the
when he
marriage is
sees
arranged.
you? What, you know.
Well, unfortunately, he found out a little bit before the marriage that he was getting the wrong girl. And because these marriages are arranged by God, you can't just say, whoops, I asked for the wrong person. Because this was sold to me and sold to my father by the prophet at that time, that this was a revelation from God. And it was just between the prophet and Merrill that it was a little deal that they had going on between the two of them. Merrill is one of the most influential and powerful men within the society.
He seems to have had the ear of the leader. At
he
the time.
He did at that time, and he did with the following the prophets that followed after that. This society is not a society where a man can go in and just make arrangements for whichever woman he wants within the society. It doesn't work that way. He was only able to do this because he had power. So right off the...
What gave him power?
He worked his way up in the ranks, and his father was a very powerful man. His father was an apostle that was next in line to be a prophet. And he was his father's favorite son, and it just went on from there. And he was able to work his way up in the ranks. And
how old were you when you were chosen, if mistakenly?
18.
18. Can you recall the moment when you were told, is it your father or your mother? I presume it's your father in your society.
It's almost always a father, and your mother is not allowed to give you that kind of information.
What was involved, and what did it feel like? What did you think?
It was like being hit in the head with two sledgehammers at the same time. It was a horribly traumatic experience. I was sleeping. My mother came down at 2 a.m. and woke me up and said, "Your father needs to speak with you." So I went upstairs, and he was in my mother's room, and I was just in a daze and half asleep and confused as to why he would want to talk to me at that hour. And he said, I talked to the prophet about you going to school to be a doctor, because I was requesting to go to college at that point. I wanted to be a doctor. He says, you've been given permission to be a teacher. However, the prophet feels that it's strong that you are married before you go to college, and you belong to Merrill Jessup. I didn't know Merrill Jessup personally. I knew of him. He was a very influential man in the community. But it was terrifying. Actually, around 80% of the girls would marry men fairly close to their same age. It was around 20 that married into plural situations and married older men. So it wasn't something that happened a lot. And a man that was 50, I mean, sometimes he would get additional wives after 3, but you had to have a lot of prestige and status to get a wife after you had 3 wives. And so that was another thing that was somewhat unusual. And it was just a shock. It was horrifying.
You would have been wife number
4.
Wife number 4. And to be honest, he was no oil painting either.
No.
So you knew what he looked like?
Yes, I did.
So you're going, great. I've got this slob guy, this middle-aged slob who's going to be all over me. That is just what I want.
I'm
not becoming a doctor. I've got Merrill the slob. Thank you, Lord.
I think I was more terrified.
Did you sort of go, Bullshit, prophet, bullshit. This is nonsense. This is absolute crap. I don't believe it. Did you still believe it at that stage?
I did. I mean, at that point, you have to understand when you're brainwashed and you're kept away from normal society, and it's the only life that you're ever allowed to see or experience. And there is quite a strong belief in indoctrination. But my older sister Linda had tried to escape the community when she turned 18. Before she was involved in an arranged marriage, and she got dragged back and basically forced into an arranged marriage, and I saw that as an example of things could be a lot worse if you tried to get out of it.
Because
not
physical
better.
violence also seems to have been, quite accepted, whether it's towards your children or your spouse. So I presume that she got a hiding when she came back.
She got in a lot of trouble, and she was not allowed to leave. I mean, she was chased and hunted down until finally, she caved in and did what they wanted, because it's like it just never ended. And she went to the police. I mean, it's just like there was no way to back the situation off. And that's a story of its own. But that was my example of what happened if you didn't want to do what the prophet told you to do. And then within the society, if you reject an arranged marriage or the word of God, you're rejecting God in your life in a very literal way. I mean, you have no place within the community or the society. You have no hope of a salvation or to go to heaven. You definitely are going to hell. And I think the thing that's the very worst for a young woman is the fear of what will happen to your family, because they end up so horribly ostracized for raising a rebellious daughter that would go up against the prophet of God.
What was your dad's disposition, your father? Like I now know in middle age, that I have a different relationship with my sons than I do with my daughters. I get on very well with my sons, but I'm not really as protective of them in the sense of what relationships they may enter into in the future, who they might end up being married to. I mean, you wish the best for them and you hope that it'll be good and it'll be profitable, emotionally for them. But with your daughters, you tend to be, and I think it's tough for any boy walking through my door anyway, and I presume it's the same with a lot of other men. You look at them and you kind of go, Jesus, if anybody does anything to hurt her, I'm going to kill him. Mm-hmm. What was your dad's disposition towards you going off to Merrill the Slob?
Well, it's different because he was a devout believer that this was a revelation from God, and he thought Merrill was a good guy and this was an honorable place for his daughter to be placed. And no, there was not any form of protection. I mean, no fatherly protection there.
No arm across your shoulder, no tears, my little girl, I don't like this happening. None of that. And I bet you were hoping for that.
Well, my father actually could have rejected the marriage for me. If he would have done that, he could have protected me from it, and he chose not to. And his attitude was, sometimes we don't understand what God has for us, but you will be blessed if you will just be faithful and do what the prophet has instructed you to do. And I mean, he just gave me a religious sermon, which was very standard in the religion. I mean, we prayed 5 or 6 times a day, and we read scriptures every night for an hour or 2 hours. And, every day and every moment of life was centered around our religious beliefs, and down to the way you comb your hair, to the time you get up in the morning, to how you dress, and things you're allowed to say, and who you're allowed to speak to and associate with. Is this
an Old Testament and New Testament religion?
Somewhat Christian, but it's basically like the religion's just something that evolved out of the original Mormon church. But the thing everybody needs to understand is it's so different from the Mormon church that in some ways when people call it Mormon, I cringe because I know it does not really compare at all. I mean, there's such few things we hold in common. I mean, like the Mormon church, they don't believe in drinking coffee or alcohol. And in this religion, some of the leaders were alcoholics, so alcohol is a big part of the religion, and so is coffee. So, it's just something that basically evolved over time to the taste of whoever was the prophet at the time.
Yeah, this is make it up as you go along.
Yeah, make it up as you go along, just like the arranged marriages.
You're stuck in traffic. You don't like your job. Your boss is evil. Your car is falling to pieces. It cost more to fill it with petrol than it did to buy. People always think you're 10 years older than you are because you are. Nothing you own is actually paid for. Your house payment is 3 months overdue, and so is your girlfriend. Nothing is as important as The Will Leahy Show, Monday to Friday, 5 to 7 p.m. on 2FM. Everything else can wait.
2FM.
Carolyn Jessup in studio, and she's the author of Escape, her story of her time living with the fundamentalist community, the Breakaway Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. They're not original Mormons. These are a group who broke away, excessively fanatical people who brought polygamy and other practices to their new world and their new lives, and they still exist and they're still out there, and this woman escaped from them. Now, you get hitched, if only spiritually, because you're not his first wife, you're his fourth wife to Merle. And because, as you told us earlier on, you all live in the same house.
Yes, we lived.
How did the other wives treat you?
Horribly. Well, I was so much younger than them. And it was an extreme threat to them to have Merle all of a sudden marry this really young woman, and she moves in on top of them and their children and their family. And then there's always the pecking order of who's going to control. And when you throw it, and you get that very well established in a family, but when you throw a new wife in, that can always change. And even though a man may be really in love with like the third wife or the second wife, when you throw a new wife in, very often he will fall out of love with the wife that he was in love with once and fall in love with the new wife. So there's always that risk. But I think the thing that was particularly challenging for me is that Merle had 10 teenage daughters that were all around my same age. And it was
Must have been a nightmare.
It was horrible because these girls all wanted their daddy's attention, and they wanted time with daddy, and they daddy this, daddy that, and I wanted nothing to do with him. But because
you were there going, yeah, you have him, fine.
Right, but because I was a new wife and we were having an intimate relationship, that made me an enormous threat to them. And so
you're like a daughter who's having legitimate sex with her father. I mean, it's
exactly.
It's an incendiary device.
Exactly, and so that was like a level that they couldn't compete on, and they were very threatened by me, and then they were also threatened that I would take their father from their mother. And so it was terrible. I mean, Is it spoken about? Were these things spoken about? Did it burst out? Did it burst through the skin or the veneer of civilized behaviour in the house? Oh, yes, it did. And even to the smallest child would come up to you and say, when are you going to go home? We're sick of you being here. I mean, the 2-year-olds or the ones that are barely starting to talk were talking. It was not something that was hidden. I mean, it was very much out in the open. And you'd walk into a room where, you know, several of the daughters would be, or maybe one of the wives, and everybody would go silent and they'd stop talking because you walked in, so you knew they'd been talking about you. And then... So whatever Little House on the Prairie was, this is like the polar opposite to it, isn't it? Absolutely. It was just intense. Now, the sex thing, how's that worked out? How do you decide who's going to bed with him? Every man is different. In the community I was in, they all decided, I mean, they had different policies with that, but some men had a schedule. If you had 3 wives, every third night you saw your husband, and he would just take turns sleeping with different wives. Merrill didn't do it that way. He had Barbara, the third wife, was his favorite wife, and she was the wife that he was actually in love with. And so he still had a religious obligation to all of his other wives to father children with them. Mm. But he didn't like to sleep with them. So every night he slept with Barbara. And if he chose to have sex or an intimate relationship with another wife, he would go to her room and do that. But it was very rare that he ever spent like a night with me. And was the sex an appalling affliction? It was for me, but then I had no relationship with him. And he was 3 times my age, and I couldn't relate to him. And he was 10 years older than my dad. And of course, so you start having children, because the concept of contraception is utterly alien. Well, it's not allowed. Yeah, it's sinful. It's horribly sinful because, you know, we believe that in the preexistence you're a spirit and you have to be choice and chosen enough to come to the work of God, and only really precious spirits get that opportunity. So as a woman, if I prevented human life from coming, by even rejecting my husband and telling him, no, I didn't want to have a baby, then I was denying a spirit the right to come to the work of God.
They were all queuing up waiting to come down.
Right. Yeah. That had earned that right, and God had selected to come, and he would have to go somewhere else.
How many children did you eventually end up with?
I had 8.
You'd 8. And what made you decide eventually, I've got to get out of here?
It was a combination.
It's a monumental decision to make.
It was a combination of so many things. I mean, first of all, I was horribly unhappy with my life, and my children were being abused. I didn't like the way I was treated in Merrill's family. I had never had a relationship with him. He was very abusive, had a horrible temper, it was a long road. But one of the points that broke down for me was Merrill sent me to a motel to manage one of his motels that he owned, and there was a man there that former management had hired for security purposes, but he was around 70 or so, but he had actually at one point in his life been a hitman for the mafia and spent 20 years in prison, and very good with the gun and a lot of other things. But he's the one who started educating me about domestic violence. I was clueless. I had grown up in such an isolated environment, I didn't even know that there was something called domestic violence. I mean, if a woman in our society was being beaten, she kept that very quiet.
She was ashamed.
It was her fault.
Of what she had done to bring this upon herself.
Right. And she was obviously done something pretty bad for her husband to have to use those tactics to control her. So James started educating me about domestic violence and explaining that I was actually involved in a dangerous situation, and he told me some other graphic things about my husband that were, I agreed with actually, but weren't pleasant to hear. And then that was the first fundamental thing that made me just stop and take a look at what I was really involved with, and beyond the religious aspects. And I'd never been happy, and everything he said made sense and made true. And James, actually, I developed somewhat of a relationship with him because he was very protective of me. And James became the first man in my life I ever trusted.
Now, I'm not going to go into your escape because it's such a fantastic story, and I'd like people to come to it fresh in the book. They know you do escape. But just in the last minute that's left with us before we finish this conversation, do you believe in God now, still?
I do. I've jokingly expressed that if I didn't when I was involved in this, I do now, because it's such a miracle I got out and I was able to.
How do you feel about men?
Men? Well, I have a wonderful man in my life now. I didn't pursue that, but 18 months after I left, I met Brian, who I'm still with. We've been together for over 3 years.
Have you had children?
No, not together. I feel like 8 is enough.
It is kind of enough, really, isn't it?
Well, and Brian has 2.
Do you see your children still?
I have all of my children. I was the first woman to ever get all of her children out and to get custody of them.
Well, I think you're pretty incredible. I think it's an amazing story. It took me 2 nights to read it, and that's always a very, very good sign. I think it's kind of impossible to put down. It's sort of heady mixture of sex, colditz. That's kind of what it's like in a way. It's like a wartime escape story with all the tension and drama of that. And a story that, only for the fact that I've heard other versions or types of this story, that you wouldn't believe. It's almost beyond belief. Carolyn, thank you very much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning.
Gerry